Trump won. He's back in office starting in January. Now, Trump made a lot of campaign promises. This being a real estate channel, we're going to focus on Trump's plan to help housing because when it comes down to it, it turns out that the voters' number one priority had to do with affordability and housing affordability, maybe more specifically. So it's a hot topic for Americans because obviously affordability is a challenge right now. Whether you want to blame inflation, whether you want to blame immigrants, whether you want to blame cost of supplies, anything doesn't really matter. People are feeling it in their pocketbook, and so they voted accordingly. Promises are one thing, but actually being able to get the promises that you made passed through Congress, well, that's another thing. It seems as if we're going to have a Republican-controlled Congress. So for Trump to get some of his promises or many of his promises passed through may not be as much of a challenge without a Democrat majority. Many people sat on the sidelines as we approached the election because each of the presidential candidates had a plan for what they were going to do to help the housing situation. Okay, understandable to a certain extent. But know that the president is elected in November. They don't actually take office for another 2 months from here. And it's not like housing is going to be changed from day number one. It just doesn't work like that. Things that are enacted by the president have to go through the process of going through Congress, getting approved, getting tweaked here and there, because it's not going to be necessarily everything that he said word for word. There's going to be some negotiation back and forth. And in other words, what I'm saying is it's a process. So waiting for the president to take office because he thinks something magical is going to happen with housing on day one or by the end of January, probably unrealistic. So keep that in mind as you're considering waiting for something to happen. It could be a while before this comes to fruition. And no offense, but all politicians say things to get elected, and then the reality of the situation when they get into office doesn't always necessarily match. We'll see how it goes. All right, so let's take a look at Trump's plan for housing and talk about how each of those parts may or may not work out. He has said his plan is to fix housing affordability in two main areas: housing supply and regulatory barriers. Those two main areas broken down into 5 parts. Part number 1 is to increase housing supply through federal lands. So he believes that the federal government owns a lot of land that could be used to increase the housing supply. In other words, taking some of the vacant federal land that the government owns, making some of it available to the public to be sold so that new housing developments can come in, thus creating more housing for people to purchase. Now, this is a great idea in areas where that's available and the land is usable. If you take a look at the map that shows where the government owns land, the majority of the land that the government owns is out west or in Alaska. And if you know anything about the topography of the United States, the further west you go, the more mountainous you get. Sometimes the more desert that you get. Things are just drier. So yes, there is land that's there that could be made available to the public. The question is that land able to be built upon? Breaking up mountains and rocks is not super easy. Then you have to have the availability of water to get to those areas in order for people to sustain life, of course. And so there are areas out west that have a significant drought issue. You know, if you look at Lake Mead out there in Las Vegas, it just keeps shrinking every year because they just don't get enough rain to sustain the level of the water that they need. And Lake Mead provides water to several states around it. So they're running out. And so when you find areas out west that you want to make available to build upon, great idea, but is it sustainable? Is it going to be usable land? And how easy will it be to cultivate that into livable areas? Number 2, he would like to cut down on the housing construction regulations and some of the zoning restrictions that construction faces. He aims to restrict certain zoning laws, environmental restrictions, and safety codes that some of the construction currently faces to make it easier to actually get things built. Don't have to wait for permits necessarily, maybe as long as they are now. Now, a couple of things with that. Yes, it can speed up the process of construction, thus we get homes built faster, and I think that that is certainly a great thing. But when you look at what that could possibly mean, some of those safety codes, regulations, zoning, and all of that is there for the safety of the future homeowners or the future business owners that are going to be taking over those buildings. So which restrictions are going to get taken away, and what does that do for the safety of those properties? Not to mention that a number of those rules and regulations are actually created at a local level. There are local ordinances, and the federal government doesn't necessarily have control over those local regulations and ordinances. And so while this seems like something that can speed up the construction process, it may not be something that the president or the federal government can have any control over. Now, certainly immigration has been a big topic for a long time, and Trump and the Republicans have been complaining about illegals coming into the country, and they're taking over our jobs, they're taking over available homes, and there certainly is some truth to that. So when it comes to plan number 3, it has to do with, well, number 1, he wants to deport a number of illegal immigrants. And if you believe the numbers that he talked about, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that could be being deported. So if and when that ever comes to fruition, well, then maybe the next part comes into play. He would like to ban access for undocumented immigrants to get mortgages. Okay, if they're not paying taxes and not contributing to the overall well-being of a community, I can understand where they would be banned from possibly getting access to a mortgage. So they can't be a homeowner, and they're not taking potential available home away from somebody else who is here legally. My one, like maybe several, but one question I have in regards to that is, does this stop a corporation from coming in, like an investment company, who would buy that property and then they wind up renting it to that undocumented immigrant who is willing and able to pay the money that they want for the rent, and it doesn't really create more housing for people? I'm not saying that this would necessarily happen, but that is kind of a workaround. Maybe it just makes it more available for these large corporations like Blackstone and others to buy even more property that they're going to use for rentals to whomever can afford that. Number 4 has to do with supporting first-time home buyers. Now, both candidates for president had a plan to help first-time home buyers. Trump did not have any specifics necessarily to the plan, but it's very likely something that would include tax credits or some sort of rebate program for down payment. There have been first-time homebuyer programs in the past. There still is currently down payment assistance, and you don't necessarily have to be a first-time homebuyer to qualify for that. But we've seen this before, and it is definitely something that can be useful. It's just a matter of what will that plan look like and who does it benefit. Number 5, Trump during his campaign vowed that he was going to lower mortgage rates. Not anything specific to how he was going to do that. He claims that his economic policies were drill baby drill, and tariffs are going to bring in more money. And so essentially what he is saying is that his economic policies are going to change the landscape of how much money people are making in our country, lowering the cost of things for our country, and making the economic outlook for the country better. That in and of itself, he believes, is going to cause mortgage rates to go down, because the overall economy is just going to be better. The Fed, that controls the Fed fund rate that has to do with interest rates, is a part of the government, but it is separate from the government. And the president doesn't necessarily have control over the factors that go into that Fed fund rate. There are a number of factors. Some of it has to do with employment or unemployment, has to do with the T-bills, and those go up and down because that all has to do with the stock market. And honestly, it's kind of weird, but when unemployment is high or higher, that actually helps to bring interest rates down. We all would love it if unemployment was very low, but when unemployment is too low, then interest rates inevitably go up. You're also looking at inflation and whether or not that's going to remain around 2%, which is the Fed's goal, is to have inflation be around 2%. We do need to have some inflation. It can't be zero. So if inflation starts going back up, that for the last few years is what has kept interest rates higher, because inflation was just significantly higher than it was in recent years. As inflation has started to creep back down to the 2% range, and it was recently in the last couple of months lower than it has been in quite some time, you saw interest rates start to come down. Had a recent jobs report that wasn't necessarily a good result. Thus, even though rates had come down the previous month, then rates started to creep back up over 7. And again, the president doesn't have control over that. He might have control over some aspects of it, but he can't just come straight out and say, I would like for interest rates to be this number. It doesn't work that way. All right, so that is President-elect Trump's plan to help housing in the next 4 years. And keeping in mind, 4 years is all he has. It could be something that happens by the end of 2025, some of this anyways. It could also be something that takes 4 years to come to fruition. It could be something that never happens altogether. How the world is going on, what's going on with pricing of things, how inflation works. There are so many factors that go into housing that the president can control some, cannot control others, sort of determine how housing goes. Now, as I've said before, and I say to a lot of my clients who are sort of on the fence about buying a house, don't let the government necessarily dictate when you're ready to buy a house. If you're going to be getting a loan to buy a house, talk to a lender, get your pre-approval, get your score analyzed to see where you are in terms of affordability on a house in the present market. If the numbers work out for you where you can afford a house at a payment that you are comfortable making on a monthly basis, buy the house, because that's really all that matters. Interest rates are something that are out of your and my control. If you buy the house, you get into a fixed rate mortgage. If the interest rates go up because the economy is not doing great, you've already got a locked in fixed interest rate, and that does not affect you. If the economy turns around and is fantastic and rates fall down, and honestly, if rates go back into the 3 to 4% range, the economy is not doing well, there's something wrong. But if they get into the 6% range or possibly the mid to high 5% range, that would be fantastic, obviously. And if you are locked into a fixed rate that's higher than that, talk to your lender about the possibility of refinancing, because you may qualify to refinance, and then you get a lower payment in a house that you already like. And while you're in that house, you are continuing to grow equity in the house where you own more and more of it, and it helps to increase your net worth. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Brian. I'm a realtor here in Indianapolis, and I'd love to answer any questions you may have about housing, the future of housing, and how this could affect you and your situation. I'm going to put a link down in my notes for you to reach out to me if you have any questions or you want to schedule an appointment. Thanks for watching.